Welcome to the Be Well at Usask podcast with me, Jocelyn Orb. In this special episode, I'm going to be talking to Simonne Horwitz, Associate Professor in the Department of History and Co-Chair of the Provost Committee on Gender and Sexuality. We're going to be discussing the significance of pride, what it means to Simone, and to explore challenges that persist for our LGBTQ2S+ staff, students, and faculty. Welcome to the podcast, Simone. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
Can you start off by telling me a little bit about your role on campus and how long you've been with the U of S?
I've been here for 12 years now. As you said, I'm an associate professor of African history and medical history, and I'm the co-chair of the Provost Committee on Gender and Sexuality. I love being in the classroom. That's my absolute favorite thing, and working with students, and I do that as much as I can. On the Provost Committee, my role as co-chair, the project I've mostly been working on is the queer housing project in the last couple of years, which I'm really proud of.
Wonderful. I was just making a note here to ask you about the queer housing project, because it's actually not something that I know a lot about. I have seen it, information come up on pause, but do you want to tell us a bit more about that project?
So the Queer Housing Project is just at the end of its first year, and we have rooms set aside in the residences for students who identify as 2S LGBT+, and they live together in their residence room. It's 4 rooms with a shared kitchen and 2 bathrooms, but they're still integrated into the broader res and campus life. And the idea is to give them a place where they can feel at home, where they can share ideas, where gender variance is accepted, but to still have them as part of the broader community. We also have special programming for them to help them feel at home, to help them deal with issues that might come up. And this is something that we've wanted for a long time. We have students who come to university, don't feel comfortable sharing a room in some dorms. We have students who unfortunately have been kicked out of their families and their homes and have nowhere to go. And this has been a really amazing, safe space for students to live and express themselves and meet other people and share their life experiences.
That sounds wonderful. So I was going to ask, what the motivation or what the impetus was for that project, but you answered that question. It sounds like it came from students themselves, which is fantastic, and it's good to hear. It leads kind of into the next question as well, which is, how would you say things have changed for the queer community on campus over the time you have been at the U of S?
Over the time I've been at the U of S, I think there's definitely much more visibility for the queer community on campus than there was the decade ago. I think the university's plan that now includes a focus on diversity and inclusion is important. I think that the university's support for certain efforts like the Queer Housing Project, gender-neutral washrooms is the other thing that we've had come to the fore in the last couple of years. The fact that the university is working hard to make forms and other forms of communication gender neutral. I think these are all important steps which enable queer faculty, staff, and students to be themselves. I don't think that we've done enough. I think that there's still work to be done to open up spaces to hear the voices of queer faculty. And I think it's important that we remember that one size doesn't fit all, and that the community is very varied on campus, even amongst the professors. And I think we need to work for different ways for people to feel that they can be their true selves.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not an expert in accents, Simone, but it does sound like you're not from Saskatoon.
No, I'm not from Saskatoon. I'm South African.
We should have brought this up earlier. Because I'm interested to know what your experience has been, just not even thinking about institutionally, but sort of the culture in, central Canada in comparison to South Africa.
It's very different, and it's taken me a long time to settle in. I miss home all the time. I come from a very close family, but also far more openly queer friends in South Africa. The queer community is much more open and accepted if you're white and privileged. So there is a very big divide between the privileged white community that I grew up in and queer people of color in South Africa who face incredible violence and incredible difficulties. But in my privileged world, I found people so much more open than when I arrived here. And so few people, especially 12 years ago, would talk openly about being queer. When I started mentioning casually in my classes that my partner was a woman and just openly spoke about it, the fact that my hair's a rainbow also gave it away a little bit. Students were shocked. And a lot of queer students came to tell me that they had never had a professor who openly in class spoke about their sexuality. In South Africa, when I was at university 20 years ago, we had open faculty. So I find that that's one of the big differences. And people are much closer in South Africa, and they do things together, and they always in each other's homes and asking very personal questions, which is not the case in Canada. So sometimes I feel that I have kind of crossed a boundary by asking personal questions. But then I just say, well, it's cultural difference, which it really is. But I love my students here, and I've taught in South Africa and England. And our students here don't take things for granted that students in other parts of the world do. And so I've been really happy teaching the students here, although I miss home.
Well, you know what? Thank you for bringing up that point about privilege, because I think, being a woman who is not heterosexual, I don't often think about being in a position of privilege, but it's relative, isn't it? When you look at what other people in different parts of the world and of different skin colors or ethnicities face, and aren't able to be out and aren't able to talk to their students or their colleagues about their sexuality. So that's an important piece to bring forward. You did mention about being open with your students and that you're an out faculty member, and you talk about your own experiences. Why do you think that's important to do?
When I was a student, I very often was looking for role models. I was looking for people who were like me, and looking for people who could understand what I'd gone through, but also just to see me, to acknowledge my struggles. And I wanted to be that person for my students, and I didn't want to have them have to look as hard as I did to find those role models. So I want my queer students to see that here's a person, and I talk about my struggles as well, who's had struggles, who's had quite a complicated life, but I've got to a point where I'm happy with myself, and I also I see myself as a successful academic and teacher, and I think that that's really important. And I think for students, all role models are important, whether it's Indigenous faculty or racialized faculty, women, queer people, and for them to see diversity in the classroom and for them to see that it's okay to be yourself, I think is really, really important. And at the beginning of each term, at the beginning of each of my classes, I send out a little questionnaire that asks the students why they're taking my class, what they want to do. But the two questions that I think are most important is, one, I ask them what name they would like to use, and two, I ask them what their pronouns are. Mm-hmm. And that serves two purposes. It says to the queer students, whether they're trans or not, that I'm aware of the fact that people would like to use different pronouns, and I have no problem with that. But it also signals to the non-queer students in the class that this is a safe space, that this is a space where we are open to these kinds of issues. And so I think that having that kind of equality in the classroom and being able to be seen and heard and not to feel different, but to feel that you can be part of the mainstream in a classroom, I think is really important. And I speak to a lot of my students about it, and I know that it means something to them. And sometimes I'm almost teary when they say thank you, because I'm living my life, so it helps me too. It's not only that I want to be a role model for them, but I want to live my life. I don't want to have to keep saying partner and then or using words that talk about me in a way that's not me. I want to live my life. And so I see this as having two benefits. It gives me the opportunity to live my life, but it gives the students a role model as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a sense of freedom for yourself. I can see that. Personally, not using pronouns to describe one's partner for many, many years. It's just so much easier to be able to express yourself as you normally would. So part of the reason why we're doing this special episode is because it's Pride Month. So no longer just a day or no longer just a parade. It's now actually Pride Month. So I have just a quick question about that. What does Pride mean to you? Two-part question. What does Pride mean to you? And what is the importance of Usask and the broader society or city of Saskatoon continuing to observe it?
To me, Pride is specifically about creating space, hearing voices, being visible as a queer community. And I think it's important to remember that Pride began as part of the Stonewall uprisings as a response to police violence, which is incredibly poignant right now, is that it was a response to police violence acted against the queer community. And it became a struggle for human rights and for queer visibility. And in the 60s and 70s, being openly queer and walking through the streets was really revolutionary. And I don't ever want to forget that. I don't ever want to forget that part of the reason we can have pride and part of the reason I can openly be myself is because of the shoulders of all those people we're standing on. And so for me, pride is both a time to become and be heard and be seen, but also a time to remember, and a time to remember that we're lucky in Canada. Mm-hmm. Not only were we one of the first countries to legalize gay marriage, but we have so many advanced rights, and that's not the case in 70 countries where same-sex sex is still criminalized, 9 countries where homosexuality is punishable by death, and we're global citizens. And I think that this is really important for us to remember. For the university itself, I think that these symbolic actions, taking part in Pride, talking about Pride, is really important because it exemplifies the missions and values and vision of the university, and it puts it out there and says to queer students, faculty and staff, here we are, we're supporting you, we have your back. Yeah. Just that it's not enough to put up rainbows for, yes, it's not a day anymore, it's a month, but the rainbows go back in the box at the end of the month. And I think it's important that we still hear from the queer community right through the years, and we don't forget gender diverse communities for the rest of the year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It just, what your last statement there about putting the rainbows back in the box made me think of the rainbow path that's been painted here on campus, and what your reaction was to when it was defaced a couple of months ago.
It really hurt and upset me that not only the rainbow path was defaced, but also the homophobic graffiti on some of the churches who have been so welcoming and so open to the queer community, that they've really made a difference. And this kind of, it is a kind of violence. The symbolic violence, I think, is incredibly hurtful. And the only thing that I can take from that is it was one person. We know who it was. We know it's a person who has trouble, and I really hope that the person is able to get help. What I can take from it, although I was horrified by the action, was the reaction of other people. It wasn't just the queer community, the people who went with chalk and wrote beautiful messages outside each of the churches. It took us a while to deal with the rainbow walkway on campus, but it was repainted. And it's not the first time it's had to be repainted, but the fact that it is repainted shows a continuing commitment. But it does hit very, very close to home to know that there are still people who have those feelings. And again, it reminds us that we haven't won all the battles and we still have education to do. It's not just about fighting for rights, but there are people out there who need to be educated and who need to meet queer people and see that we're actually, we're just people, and that we care too. And I think that that's one of the things that this kind of graffiti and symbolic violence tells us, is that we have to keep working at it on a personal level as well as an institutional level.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we make assumptions sometimes that because being queer is more widely acceptable now in Canada and in Saskatchewan and Saskatoon more so than it ever has been. But it is a reminder that we still have a long way to go. Just touching on that, what would you like to see the university do or take on to improve the lives of students from the queer community, say in the next 5 years? What are your hopes?
I think that I couldn't end the podcast without saying that the students have been amazing. In the last couple of years, the students have led change. The students have really, what's happened in the Pride Center has been incredible. What's happened at wellness, that students can get queer positive counseling, that there's medical care for trans students, that students can get access to the kinds of treatment they need. That's all incredible. And I hope that the university continues to support that. I hope that the university continues to support things like queer housing, that we have more gender neutral washrooms, that we start to talk about queer faculty openly, not just during Pride Month, but that we allow people or we make space to talk about issues, and that it's not just the Provost Committee for Gender and Sexuality, but that we have issues around gender and sexuality worked in to the daily mission of the university. And I hope that more faculty and staff speak up and become role models. I know not everybody feels comfortable with that, but those who do, to support those students who've been so visible and so out. And so I think we should also be listening to them and seeing what they need, and for the university to not put roadblocks in the way of these projects, but to support them and to be proud of them, and to support what the students are doing, what wellness is doing, what the few faculty who are fighting these battles are doing. I think to have more education, to have more people doing the Positive Space 101 courses, so that when I go into an office, there's not an assumption because of my gender presentation on campus. When I call a number on campus and I'm talking about medical care or my partner, I'd really like it to come to a point where there is no assumption of who my partner is. I would like our trans faculty members to never be dead named. I would like the university to allow trans students easier to change their NSIDs. We've been working on that. That's the other thing we've worked on. And those kinds of things, that they seem like they're just small issues, right? Log onto your NSID. But for somebody who has changed their name, and for someone who the trauma of seeing those initials every day when they log in is incredibly traumatic. And so to not stand in the way of those kinds of issues, I think could make a huge difference, because those little things add up, because we want to be seen and heard, but we also just want to be part of the community. And not have to fight and not have to educate all the time. It would be really great if people other than the queer community could also take on some of the role. I love teaching, but I don't want to teach about queerness all the time.
All the time, yeah.
Yeah.
So this isn't a question that I've asked anyone else, but because you're a professor of history, and I don't want to stump you with this because you might not know the answer. If you don't know the answer, we'll just edit it out. But one of our staff members has put the picture up in our copy room for us all to see of the two women kissing on campus, taken 60, 70, 80 years ago. Do you know the history of that photo?
Funnily enough, it's the book cover of my partner's book. So,
yes,
my partner, Valerie Cornack, is the author of Prairie Fairies, which is a history of LGBT communities in the province. That's actually Nan Mackay, our first Métis graduate. It's very interesting that we don't talk about that when we talk about Nan Mackay. That's the other thing that would be amazing from the university, is when we mention her all the time, she wasn't only the first Métis graduate, she was an openly queer woman. And that picture is part of a collection of her photographs, which is part of the Neil Richards Special Collection at the University of Saskatchewan. It's part of her book, in which you see her life with the women she was around. And that photograph, which has become so symbolic of the university, I think is really special. We don't know who the other woman is. She wasn't named. But that's the other thing that's amazing, is if you go into the collections that we have at the U of S and you look through and you see those photographs that she's left, plus what Neil Richards has left, we have a history on campus of queer activism.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm so glad I asked you that question. Well answered, by the way.
Thank you. I've lived this book for.
It would be embarrassing if you.
Of it.
It would be really embarrassing if you did not know the answer now.
Exactly.
So one thing I am asking all the guests is, because of this time that we're in a global pandemic and our lives have changed so significantly, if you're willing to share just one thing you're doing to be well right now, something that brings you a sense of joy or connection, what would that thing be, and how do you find it helps you?
I think there are two things. I'll try and be brief. Okay. I'm a very people person and a huge warrior, so this has hit me really hard. The first thing is I have a small cuddly dog, and he has helped me. I've lived with bipolar for the last 6 years, and he was my kind of therapy dog, but now he's been my COVID therapy dog. We try to walk 10,000 steps a day, and that gets me up no matter what happens, and he loves me no matter what happens. The other thing is, in the beginning of the pandemic, I was so worried about the isolation, but actually so many interesting things have come up, and I can Zoom with people in South Africa, and I can go to my synagogue services that I would go to in South Africa. And when I started to take part in those and started to actually actively seek out things I was interested in, I couldn't believe how many interesting things there was. So I tell people, get a dog and get involved, or a cat.
Good advice. And that last part about cats was paid for by the Saskatchewan Cat Association. Okay, that's really helpful. I appreciate you sharing that. Is there a final thought you'd want to leave listeners with, touching on any of the topics we've discussed today?
I think what I would like to leave listeners with is the fact that I think we need to acknowledge that life is hard, but we're not alone. And I want people to know that it gets better. I've been through a lot of struggles with myself and with acceptance, and I know from that it gets better, but I also know that you need to reach out. And we have services on campus. We have people like myself who are willing to speak to students or other faculty members. And I think A, it gets easier, but B, there are allies, friends, and resources that can walk with you. And you need to make use of those because they understand. And I think that that's so important.
Mm-hmm. No, I completely agree. And thank you. You've mentioned a couple times throughout this, the wellness services on campus. And so I will mention that probably at the end of this podcast, just so that students are aware of the services that we do offer and that we're a positive space. What I want to say is thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today, Simone. I really appreciate your perspective, your life experience, the fact that you've been open and really shared part of yourself today. I appreciate that. Thanks for listening to the Be Well at Usask podcast with me, Jocelyn Orb. And thanks again to Simone for joining me and sharing. Please check in again for further episodes and more content related to being well. Please subscribe and share this podcast. You can find us on multiple platforms, including Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. We'd also love to hear from you. Please post comments and questions, and we'll look to include them in future episodes. Also, if there's someone you'd like to see as a guest or a topic you'd like us to cover, or even a reaction to an episode you want to share, please write to us at bewell.podcast@usask.ca. Until next time, stay safe and be well.